Ivan the Terrible, ruler of Russia between 1547 to 1584, led with extreme cruelty. His leadership was characterized by brutal executions of political adversaries and perceived threats to his power. His infamous acts, such as the blinding of his own son, cemented Ivan the Terrible's legacy as a ruthlessly tyrannical leader in history.
Evil kings had reigned and could still reign now, but were they evil? Let me know as we go through the facts. Like for instance, Ivan the Terrible was known for being, well, terrible. He was given that name for his significant achievements in conquering ruthless actions and violence since he ascended the throne at the age of 16. But despite the many deaths linked to his dominion and aggressive rule, apparently the reason why he was so terrible was because of love. His first wife, and the woman who he plucked out of hundreds of options, was none other than Anastasia Romanovna. She was actually older than him by 4 years, and they would actually produce the Romanov dynasty. Apparently, they had a loving and a very happy marriage, and with 3 out of 6 surviving children, she also played a significant role in influencing his policies until she had passed away. When she died, it impacted him so greatly it spiraled him into a violent mental state, which resulted to his later descent into a more tyrannical and paranoid rule. Although it's still unknown how she died, as many feel she may have just gotten sick, others, like Ivan, justifyingly so, wanted someone to blame. And perhaps there is a chance that his enemies got to where it hurt by poisoning Anastasia. Either way, her love and her existence had such a profound meaning to his existence that he wasn't really able to open his heart ever again. Despite being remarried many times and having more offsprings to expand his legacy, his mind was still full of Anastasia. Another one would be King James I. Hygiene is very important these days, as it is a very key factor in reducing the spread of disease, viral infections, and diseases in general, but for King James I, he was very picky on what should be cleaned first, to the point where he just only cleaned the tip of his fingers. According to Sir Anthony Weldon, who was the courtier of King James I, he noted that the king never bathed, and he wished truthfully, and from the bottom of his heart, he did. According to records, Weldon noted that the king's tongue was too large for his mouth, and whenever King James I drank any liquids, it would fall down to the side of the king's chin. He wouldn't even bother to wipe his mouth, let alone wash his hands, the courtier noted, and although he would clean the tip of his fingers, he would only rub the ends just lightly with a wet end of a napkin. Apparently this was the only hygienic thing this king did. I mean, it could also relate to mental illness, or maybe it was just normalized environmentally, no one thought of it much. But it's no doubt that in history, when it comes to the 1700s in France, that the Palace of Versailles was one of the nastiest and smelliest royal palaces. Noted the royals would go to the bathroom in the corners of the halls. It smelled really bad. Apparently that's even what the King Louis XIV did. He was also known as one of the most smelliest of the royals. He would use his throne, the very throne many royals themselves would sit in, as a toilet as well. He would even use it while conducting court sessions. One would expect the court to notice the smell, but when Louis XIV was in the room, the stench of so many other people would overwhelm everyone else. It was too hard for anyone to even notice. The king only bathed 3 times his entire lifespan, which was already the low side by the 17th century standard. The king would try to make up the smell by filling his rooms with flowers and dousing himself in perfume, and he actually had a specific team designated in creating a new perfume every week. He also would change his clothes 3 times a day, which he truly believed was the only reason why he smelled bad and needed to be clean. And like his toilet habits being shown to his court, he would also have them watch him change his clothes. Yeah, he would change his clothes in front of 100 men and did so on purpose. Nice. Although the concept of gender with kings in Egypt, Hatshepsut felt otherwise. Egypt became a divided country, one at war with Hyksos, a Greek word for foreign invaders, from the area we know now as Palestine. But on the coming to the throne in 1478 BC, she is thought to be one of the most successful pharaohs. Hatshepsut of the dynasty 18 ruled to maintain the power of her young nephew, only to have her legacy as a female king, the word queen connoting a mere helpmate, not a ruler, ripped away from her 20-some years after her death, when her name and images were erased and smashed. Her great achievements relabeled for her father or brother instead, but as a note, as regent, Hatshepsut did get a taste of power, and it seems she wanted more. Hatshepsut decided that she wanted to rule as king herself, not just from behind the scenes in the name of somebody else, but at some point she decided that she would rule alongside her stepson as an equal, or even as his superior. And she wanted the title of pharaoh for herself, which again, even though this is ancient Egypt and women would rule, people still didn't like the idea that a woman would have the power to anyway. Hatshepsut's method of acquiring and holding onto the power suggested a darker side to her reign and character. She had a lover who apparently might have been noted as an evil genius, and because his actions was placed in by association, even though she had a very peaceful rule, her statuses were destroyed, and so was her statues, and her monuments were defaced, and many of her achievements were ascribed to other pharaohs. heroes. Many modern historians attribute to this ritual and religious reasons, rather than the personal hostilities as previous thought. Still, Hatshepsut was a successful politician and ruler who thrived in a world dominated by men, and she deserves to be remembered as one of history's greatest female leaders. Even though he was noted as Charles the Well-Loved, King Charles VI has ascended the throne at the age of 11, and his kingdom was governed by regents, who were pretty good at their job. It all changed though when he took personal charge of France at the age of 21. He then became Charles the Mad. To be fair, a king suffered a lot through mental illness, which of course in the years 1368 to 1422 was not even a topic to think of, which then dubbed him as the Mad King. If anything, it could also explain why so many of these tyrant kings or rulers became mad due to the consistent intertwining of bloodlines. King Charles VI would break into fits and tantrums and run wild through his home, and even forgot his own name at one point, and he was king, failed to recognize his own wife or children. Some modern scholars believe that he may have suffered from psychotic break, which believed to be his first manifestation of schizophrenia, which would lead to sporadic violent episodes and periods of inertia and confusion for the rest of his life. Which also explains where he would be convinced he was also made of glass and would not move at all, like he just wouldn't move. Psychological inertia in association with apathy is a mental state in which sufferers lack the desire, will, or energy to engage in any activity, where intellectuals become stagnant, and so is their physical activity. The unfortunate monarch would continue to slip in and out of his state until his death in 1422. And speaking of mad kings in some concepts, when it comes to King Henry VIII, there are a lot of these things that this man has done that was absolutely cruel, like killing hundreds and thousands of people under the idea of him not being ruler since he was Protestant and kicked out the Catholic Church. But imagine you were a servant at the royal palace and suddenly you were told you got promoted to work for the king. I guess you'd be pretty excited. But they didn't really explain in detail what they did when they said directly. They meant really closely, like his personal butt wiper. The groom of stool was a position in the royal household in charge of cleaning, and you guessed it, the king's backside. Specifically, King Henry VIII, among many of his reforms, King Henry VIII introduced the job as he plucked one of his sons of the not his sons, he didn't have any. As King Henry VIII introduced his job as he plucked out one of the sons of the noble families to literally wipe his butt. However, those graced with this position would also be required to watch his diet, document them, and then also be ready once the bowel movements were cha-chaing their way down. They didn't have baby wipes or baby powder, but they did have to make sure that it was clean and dry. They also had to wipe down his buttocks with sponge or a wet nurse just to be a glorified butt washer. They were also responsible for helping him urinate and defecate by providing a wash basin for them, or just for him, as a regular old pot. And considering how unhygienic the medieval times were, I don't think they had latex gloves to protect themselves. Yeah. Free hands. This job was actually considered a respected job though, as it was a direct intimate access to the king, and he would live in the castle, earn a great salary. The butt wiper, I mean. The tradition of King Henry VIII created would then be an ongoing career for the next 400 years. To be fair, this job is equivalent to many medical positions that, do the same thing now, or at least they should be paid well. In many ways, William IV was the original mad lad. Despite never being expected to take the throne, William IV proceeded to become the most unconventional king Britain has ever seen. During the American Revolution, he was fighting in the fields in the honor of his father, King George III, but he was also hanging around unprotected in Manhattan window shopping. And when the American troops heard of this, they thought about kidnapping him, and George Washington approved it. But British forces heard of this plan beforehand, and they made sure to assign guards to him at all times. But aside almost being kidnapped, as soon as he was declared king, he felt that being a sailor was more fun, and he tried to give away the Buckingham Palace multiple times. He tried to give it away to the British Army as a high-class barracks, and they said no, even turning it into a new parliament after the old one burnt down, and they also said no. But even as a sailor, he was terrible, as he was fired and went to play hooky, commandeered a squadron of ships, and didn't return for 10 days. He just didn't like this job. And despite being dumb in his youth, he did have some sense to ensure his niece Victoria did take the crown after he died. That's nice. Just after 1 month after her 18th birthday, so her mother wouldn't be queen regent, who he didn't like. Definitely a tyrant with his anger problems, Valentinian I apparently died of a stroke after screaming in rage. Valentinian was a Roman emperor from AD 364 to 375 and spent much of his reign defending the borders of the Roman Empire in Europe. Valentinian met with a group of Quadi messengers, a Germanic people of the Romans that had been fighting, to negotiate a ceasefire. The envoy maintained that the Romans had been wrong to build forts in their land and could not guarantee that all the chiefs could cease their attacks. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman soldier and historian, wrote that Valentinian then burst into a mighty fit of wrath that once he had calmed down, he was suddenly speechless and suffocating, his face was tinged with a fiery flush, and Valentinian had worked himself in such a rage that it caused him to have a fatal stroke. And we know during the American Revolution the essence of King George III was noted as the Mad King for this time, mainly because of how insane his taxing was to tax people to death for expenses that were impossible to maintain. However, despite that, King George III was actually showing signs of mental illness around 1765 early on. Many medical historians believe George's illness was characterized by hallucinations, paranoia, general breakdowns, and abdominal pain that was caused by an enzyme disorder, porphyria. Though a radioactive diagnosis is still debatable. When the American Revolution began in April 1775, the next year with the Declaration of Independence, the demands of America's freedom showcased and dictated King George III as an inflexible tyrant who had squandered his right to govern the colonies. In reality, the situation was more complex. It wasn't just George in charge, but in fact, the parliamentary ministers who were responsible for the colonial policies. Through George also means indirect influences, and the last years of George's life was compounded by deafness and senile dementia. For his cataracts, he was actually also treated with leeches on his eyeballs. King George then died as blind and deaf and mad on January 29, 1820. And finally, lastly, Nero. We know Nero as a tyrannical leader in Rome and how he was responsible for burning down Rome in order to have a reason to persecute the Christians. Although his reign in the beginning was okay, he did reduce taxes and improve the judicial system. In fact, he was also interested in art and loved music and poetry. He was even noted as a talented performer and loved being on stage as he participated in public performances, and although he did get critics for mixed reviews, he didn't mind. But then, when he started the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, and even though he claimed he didn't, I'm sure the local chismosas and human CCTVs can clarify it was him. He then continued his brutal acts on the Christians, as I mentioned, by crucifying them and burning them alive. But how did we get here? Apparently, it was his mom. The mistake of his mother, Agrippina, made was pressuring him and pushing him to become the height of Roman's power. She was extremely in control and even went ahead to poison other potential heirs to reduce the chances of succession. With her wickedness, she was shocked to find her son was actually good and merciful and was okay with even reducing his power, and even actually gave authority to senators and titles and even encouraged people to speak up. But she didn't like that, and so as part of her greediness, she planted the seed of paranoia into Nero's young mind, and the rest, as we know, is history. And speaking of history, that's all for today. Like all the people here, maybe villains don't actually see themselves as villains and see themselves as heroes. Or maybe they had a bad mom or a really bad heartbreak, but I don't think mental health checks were a thing back then. Anyways, thank you for joining. Be sure to like and subscribe. My name is Jess, and I wish you all the best. Bye!